we get to start our discussion now on the Enlightenment, and instead of, like we talked about last time, where it was sort of this theoretical approach, we're going to talk about how the Enlightenment actually began to play out around the world. It's going to start out, of course, in Europe, but is going to get exported to first to the Americas, and then really into a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. One of our major points that we have to discuss is particularly governments. The Enlightenment, and a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers, as you noticed last time, is they have a very top-down kind of worldview. This is going to be different than what you'll see when we compare what happens with Americans when they get a hold of the Enlightenment. They tend to have more of a bottom-up view of the world. So there are going to be a lot of monarchs and a lot of different interactions, and we'll see that the Enlightenment isn't going to play out, at least not initially, here in the 1700s, the way that a lot of the original thinkers had kind of in mind. So that's what we're going to be dealing with this section here. There we go. All right. We've got an interesting collision of ideas. One is the Enlightenment, which is this idea that the individual matters and that people need to get more involved, colliding with this idea of absolutism, which was this holdover idea that monarchs really wanted to be the ones in charge. They didn't want to let other people run things for them. They didn't want to divide up power like you'd seen in feudalist states. They wanted to have an ever-increasing amount of personal authority. And so that move that had been going on in the 1600s is only going to strengthen as we get here into the 1700s. To them, to the monarchs, the absolutists, this made a lot of sense. Centralization made things more efficient. It made the nation stronger. It makes the monarchy stronger. And so this, of course, is going to be an important factor for making a nation strong in the face of rival nations and nationalism. Now, these monarchs, they're not ignorant of what's going on. They're understanding. There are a lot of writers and thinkers that are critiquing society, and they're coming up with a lot of ideas on what should take place. Now, the monarchs generally and obviously are going to oppose a lot of the ideas that openly criticize them. They're not going to like that. But the Enlightenment in Europe tended to support monarchy as a model. The great example of that, of course, is Rousseau. When you get down to it, we should have this individualism, we should have this direct democracy. Well, who's going to be ultimately in charge? Well, I guess we need some kind of monarch. And in a lot of cases, the Enlightenment was not anti-monarchy, although in many cases they were anti-monarch. The particular monarch they didn't like. They wanted a more moral person at the top, but they didn't necessarily want the one that they had. A lot of these philosophes, as I mentioned, had a very top-down view of society. Their argument, ever increasing, was that if society was going to change, it was going to have to require change from above. So in many cases, they actively sought out important and influential members of society, whether it be the monarch or other people like that, and get them to enact Enlightenment reforms, because they generally distrusted a lot of the average people. They didn't like the masses of society. They felt that these people sort of upheld many of the flawed social conditions of the day, right? The rulers themselves, in many cases, would actively seek out Enlightenment thinkers, so that way they could get new ideas. So you've got this interesting interplay of people and ideas. Wow. There we go. Try this again. This is what happens when your clicker goes crazy. Here we go. This is one that we're going to revisit a little bit later. This is Frederick the Great of Prussia, and he's having his little sort of nerd meeting with all these different Enlightenment philosophes. He himself was a big fan of Voltaire, and so this is something that will be ongoing as we get throughout this period. So we're going to take a sort of a tour de force of many of these people and what they're going to be doing to try to implement this. And we won't deal with every single crowned head that and their relationship to the Enlightenment, but we'll hit a lot of the major ones. All right. We're going to start here in France. France is probably the most influential of all the Enlightenment nations. And of course that leads us to a Louis. And again, in case you missed one of the earlier videos, I apologize on behalf of France for the fact that they can't come up with any other name for their monarch other than Louis, and that means you, the student, has to memorize a whole bunch of Roman numerals in order to pass your exams. So, sorry, right? Louis XV is the one we're going to be talking about. We talked about Louis XIV before. Louis XV is going to continue along this path where he wants to be an absolutist. He wants to have absolute power for himself. But he's really not quite the same magnetic leader that Louis XIV was. And actually, he grows up in the palace. You know, you got Versailles there, you got the fancy clothes, and he's much more interested in being the court guy rather than serious oversight and governance, because let's face it, that's kind of a sub job. You know, you got to go to meetings, you got to sit at your desk, you got to read reports, you got to talk to blah, blah, blah kind of people, and so it's a pretty sucky job. So if you're gonna, wear fancy clothes and cruise around town in your carriage and pick up chicks, right? Somebody has got to do the government, because, as we've seen, thanks to the absolutist tendencies of Louis XIV, a lot of power has been invested in the monarchy. And if you're the monarch and you're not doing that job, somebody's got to. Well, he increasingly sloughed off a lot of this detail on subordinate ministers who were pretty glad to have this power for themselves. And he allowed them to gain a lot of control. He also apparently was something of a Don Juan and had a number of lady friends. And one of the things that a lot of people noticed was one of the best ways to get the king's ear was to put a woman into bed with him. And she could then, during, I guess, pillow talk time, give him advice. And of course, when he became enamored with a woman, he would listen to her. And so many people intentionally sort of put women into his path so that way they could use her as sort of a shortcut to get to him. And we're going to see that a lot of people around him are making France's government, therefore, relatively inefficient and sort of fractured in terms of policy. Throughout this period, you're going to see that the effects of this is going to be France is going to enter into a lot of wars, particularly a lot of losing wars, especially losing wars against England. During this period. Now, warfare is expensive, and that's the way that it goes, but the way to look at, especially warfare, is you're buying something with your money. When you buy a losing war, you really don't get a lot out of the deal. And so, ever increasingly, the treasury of France is going to be depleted, but Louis XV doesn't really reap the evil that's going to sow, because he's going to die. And he's going to leave the throne to his 20-year-old grandson, who will go on to be, again, I apologize, Louis XVI. If it makes you feel any better, at least Louis XVI, he's kind of the famous one of the bunch, or one of the most famous ones of the bunch, although not for necessarily a good reason, right? Well, Louis XVI really had a similar disinclination to be a serious sovereign of the people, and he kind of ran around, and he didn't really pay a whole lot of attention. But what that meant was, ever increasingly, the inefficiency of the French government, when you invest all this power in the monarch, and then eventually you get a monarch who's not really interested in exercising it, a lot of this stuff goes undone or done badly, or as we're going to see, different ministers and different court people sort of fight with each other. This is all going to land on the people of the nation. And so you've got an ever-increasing amount of discontent among the French, and for a long time, Louis XVI is kind of oblivious to this. He doesn't really seriously address this. And he continues to lead France down this period of internal corruption and mismanagement and external failures, where they enter into a bunch of losing wars. So there's Louis XV. He's a pretty good-looking dude, right? I don't know about you, but Louis XIV, he always kind of scares me, looking at him a little bit. So when we flip across the channel and look at how this is playing out in England, of course, we have to understand that the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, all the things that had happened with that, had created a sort of special case in terms of absolutism in Europe, where England doesn't really have an absolute monarch. I mean, the monarch has more power then than they have now, but compared to this sort of all-encompassing royal authority, no, Parliament is really flexing its muscle in England. But we also have to understand that Parliament isn't like our Congress today, where sort of everybody has a vote and you get to put people in there. And while not to say that it's this clean system now, the idea that sort of everybody has a say is kind of a sacrosanct part of our system. This was not the case with Parliament in England here in the 1700s. Parliament was actually only elected by the elite of society. So on the one hand, you say, oh, it's a democratic election, and people get to go and they get to vote. No, right? Only a few people were electors. It wasn't just, like 12 guys, but it wasn't the great sort of masses of the egalitarian citizenry of the people of England, right? And as I mentioned, the king still retains a great deal of authority over the body, not necessarily putting people in, but he's the one that gets to control the executive branches of the government, and he gets to nominate the ministers of these. And of course, these are some pretty plum jobs that people want to get. So he has a number of avenues that he can still flex his authority, because he can say, okay, well, I'm going to make you minister over this, and you're going to have this great job, and you'll have a great deal of power and authority, and probably money that's going to come along with this. He also has the patronage system, which means you can make you Earl of such and such and do whatever. And so the members know that on the one hand, they don't want to cede all this power and authority to the king because he'll run, kind of crazy with it. But on the other hand, they still want to stay on the king's good side because they want to get the goodies that come down from the king. Now, we're also going to see that one of the things that we do here in this country, where every 10 years we have a census to reapportion the seats as we move around the country. States that get more people, they get more say in Congress. States that lose people, they lose say in Congress. And so Parliament didn't really do that. They kind of fixed it and said, okay, these are the big cities and towns in the Middle Ages, and then there you go. So many of these seats, as the population had shifted around, they were controlled by really, really small numbers of people. And what that meant was it was really easy to kind of buy your way into some of these. These were called rotten boroughs, and you could go in and essentially you'd have a tough time today, sort of directly paying people off to get you elected to Congress. You'd have like thousands of people, to go in and pay off. Whereas these guys, if you've got a small enough number, you can kind of buy off enough of them to make sure that you win. We're also going to have a new dynasty. We've got the Hanoverian line of kings. These are people of Germanic descent. And one of their major policies is going to be the support of the merchant class. They like the fact that England's navy, England's merchant fleet is roving the seas all around the world and making England a lot of money. And one of the best ways to do this is to make sure that the English empire is constantly expanding. You're going to see that places where they're going to have access to raw materials to bring stuff in and then to take stuff back out that is processed and manufactured to have markets. This is going to work really, really well for these guys. So you're going to see to this end, George II is going to make William Pitt prime minister. We have a city, Pittsburgh, named after a William Pitt, right? So Pitt's going to pursue this policy of expansionism. To this end, he's going to win the 7 Years' War. This would be called the French and Indian War here in North America. More on that later. And this is going to help expand Britain's empire, not only here in North America, but we're also going to see in India and in East Asia as well. What that means is Pitt's successes is going to bring money and power, particularly to the absolutist tendencies of the British kings. It's going to help suppress reform of the corrupt political system. And even though Britain is going to lose parts of its American empire, this would be the part that the United States would rebel against Britain in officially in 1776, although really the fighting started the year before. It's going to end in 1782. They're also going to wind up fighting a brutal 22-year war with France when we talk about the French Revolution and the effects that happened. So there's William Pitt, and he's before the Parliament, and they're having their questions for the Prime Minister, which is really one of the great things that we've kind of missed out on here with our political system, where the Prime Minister has to get up and these members of Parliament, they get to question him on his policies and things like that. And it gets kind of raucous. At times they kind of make fun of him. Sometimes these members of Parliament, they call him almost fat and stuff like that. And so it gets kind of out of hand with this. But yeah, they have this kind of political back and forth. We really don't have anything, like that. We just kind of make fun of, Republicans and Democrats. They just kind of make fun of each other on TV, and we just kind of leave it at that. But they don't have too many direct confrontations like this. So here are the Georges. There's George I, really sort of serious looking guy. There's George II, who's better dressed but not terribly attractive. And then there's George III, right? This is the guy who's the king who loses America. Not quite all of it, but is going to lose the United States. And I've got this in here as a succession, not only to show you, grandfather, father, and son, but we've got this, I like the way the artist has done this. You know, this guy's a king, he's got the silky cravat, he's got the nice, you know, jacket, and he's got the, I don't know what's he got going on with his hair, I'm sorry about that. And then it gets progressively, you know, more ornate as you go on. You've got the French turned-back cuffs, and you got the embroidery, and you got the silky, and then you got this, right? Where you got the sequins, and you got the inlaid jacket, and you got the belt, and you got the ermine, and you got the quilts, and you got all this kind of stuff going on by George III, implying the growing power and monetary extravagance, really, of the British Empire by the time you get to George III. Also, just as a little fashion note, ladies, this is a point in world history where a man could wear pantyhose and pumps and be considered sexually irresistible. So, in case you're interested in that. All right. This is this map here gives you a good idea of parts of the British Empire by the time we get to 1815, while they've lost the United States, Canada, islands all around. Parts of West Africa, India, places here in the Far East. You got Australia, so you've got a pretty expansive British Empire that would actually only get bigger as the 1800s go on. Well, just as a little side note, right? The title of the slide, The Rise of Prussia, I've got not a typo in parentheticals because a lot of people think I've misspelled Russia. Oh, it's Prussia. Prussia, wait, why is that confusing? In English, Russia and Prussia, they sound the same. In their native tongue, Ruskaya and Preußi, they sound different. And so just, you know, when we anglicize them, it's Russia with a P, all right? For those of you who are still kind of lost, when I talk about Prussia, basically I mean Germany, okay? There isn't a Germany yet. Prussia is the northeastern part, it's the biggest part of Germany. It would be an incredibly important part, so just, you know, brace yourself, all right? Now, Prussia's going to rise to power here in the 1700s thanks to the rising power of its two main institutions. One is the bureaucracy that's helping make sure that its government is efficiently run, and the second one is its army. So in a lot of ways, Prussia is like the Sparta of the modern era. Sparta is just this little out-of-the-way Greek town. It's got a decent-sized population with this insanely killer army. Prussia's the same way. It's this country that's surrounded by potential enemies. It's, you know, it's okay. You know, it's not super wealthy. It's not super awesome. But it's got this really, really amazing military. And so that is going to be the factor that's going to make it incredibly important for the next several centuries. Well, the first monarch that we're going to be talking about here is Frederick William I, right? Friedrich Wilhelm I. Now, he's going to improve the civil service. These are the people that are working for the government. And typically, you know, as you come out of the Middle Ages, one of the boons of working in the civil service is not that you can say, well, I work for the government. It was, you know, I kind of have a license to steal. That was why you took those jobs, was, you know, you got to filch some of the money off of having that. You got to line your pockets with it. Well, of course, that's a great deal of inefficiency. And one of the things that Friedrich William made sure took place was that the civil service was tied directly to service to the state. And he's also going to open this up to the middle class. What that means is people that normally, thanks to heredity, wouldn't have had a shot at some of these government posts. You're going to come in, and if you're talented enough, you're going to do this job. But also you need to understand that how well you do this job, how honestly you do this job, is going to improve the prospects of Prussia to do well around the world. Now, he is going to expand the military, because one of the things strategically that Prussia is worried about is it's got enemies to the east, it's got enemies to the south, it's got enemies to the west. The only reason it really doesn't have enemies to the north is because it's got the ocean there. So he's going to need a bigger military, but he doesn't expand the officer corps of the middle class. He relies on the aristocrats for the officers. This is an important point, because what we're going to see is that aristocratic mentality of we're born to authority, we're born to power, is going to imbue the army. And it's going to stay in the army. And then we're going to see that essentially the army is going to be, by the end of the 1800s, the institution inside Germany. And so its sensibilities are going to get exported outside. Now, Friedrich William's son is going to be Frederick II, Friedrich, all right? And he gets the Great attached to the end of his name, so you know he must have done something fairly entertaining, right? Now, Frederick William I is a pretty serious guy, a German guy, you know, hard work, efficiency, you know, that kind of stuff. Frederick II, though, for much of his life, he's really a lot more interested in the Enlightenment thought, Enlightenment thinkers. He was pals with Voltaire. He played the flute or something like that. And so, I mean, you know, these were the guys that his father had brought in to be his instructors, and naturally they brought their Enlightenment ideas with them. And so Frederick II, he grew up with all this and he was very interested in that. So once he becomes a monarch, though, the policies that he's going to put into place are going to be in part a continuation of his father's ideas, right? He wants to continue to improve Prussia's civil laws. He makes the bureaucracy more efficient, but he does restrict this back to the nobility. He's going to add some Enlightenment ideas of civil liberties. He's going to tolerate different religious groups. He is going to open up the press laws and the freedom of speech laws some. Okay? It's not quite what you would see later on in the United States, where you can just start a newspaper where, you know, president sucks, and I hate him, and you guys should all hate him too, and you can print whatever you want, as long as you don't, you know, ask people to do something violent. You couldn't quite do that, but there's going to be a little bit more toleration. And these are Enlightenment ideas, the ideas of freedoms of speech, freedoms of expression, freedoms of the press. But really, for the most part, we have to be honest, the great comes from the fact that Frederick is one of those rare but spectacular instances where you have somebody who has the political power of a state plus military skill. Whenever you put those two together, you tend to get some pretty spectacular results, whether it's the ancient examples of guys like Caesar or Alexander or any of these other guys, or the more modern examples where you got Napoleon or Frederick the Great here, you get something worth watching. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. He's going to use his military extremely often. He's going to fight and win wars against ever-increasingly stronger European powers. Especially when we get down to the 7 Years' War, this is a war that Prussia should have lost. Prussia should have got crushed. They didn't. They wound up, you know, coming out on top in this one. And so as a result, like I said, the military and its ethos is going to imbue itself throughout the Prussian culture. This is important because eventually Prussia is going to essentially take over the rest of Germany by the time we get to the late 1800s. And this doesn't want to advance again. The slide, it hates me. There we go. Back up. Maybe it's the forward button. So there we go. Okay, so this is Prussia, right? This is what we're talking about. So this is what would be Germany now. So this is Prussia here in this northeastern part. This is Frederick William I, right? Kind of stern. I like this. I know it's kind of blurry, but I really like this picture of him just because, you know, he looks so serious. And then there's this kid, right? He's playing the flute, and he's got his little jazz ensemble, or I don't know, whatever, you know, kids are into. And there he is. He's interested in the Enlightenment and culture and the arts and whatnot. And this is the photo I told you we'd come back to. This is him meeting with his Enlightenment pals, and they're talking about, I don't know, dorky nerd stuff, you know, with this kind of thing. But this is also Frederick. This is him as the commander of the military forces. Was a great tactician, was a great strategic thinker, was good at training his men, worked on, you know, having these guys march in, you know, lockstep with each other, maintain shoulder contact, and he just was really good at not only managing the technical aspects of war, but also the human resources side of this, you know, inspiring his men. This guy is going to be one that we'll have to watch, all right? When you move south of Prussia down into Germany, what you're going to see here is this is the territory of the Austrian Empire, right? The Habsburg Empire. And the Habsburgs had found themselves on the throne here, essentially because they were weak. They were not known as great sort of, you know, money makers or great leaders or great military people. They were sort of weak, and so they put themselves. They wound up getting themselves into the seat of power with the Holy Roman Empire for that reason. The nobles wanted to kind of control them, but ever increasingly their power got bigger and bigger because the one thing that the Habsburgs were good at was marrying well and producing the right children sort of at the right time. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. Well, eventually what you're going to see here is Maria Theresa is going to find herself suddenly on the throne of the Habsburg Empire. She wasn't really supposed to be in charge, but she's a woman. You don't put women in charge of stuff like that here in these 1700s. And that's unheard of, right? And the reason for that, though, is she was never trained to be the monarch because she wasn't supposed to be. And she had a brother, and the brother then dies. And it doesn't look like she's going to have any other male heir, or, you know, that her father's not going to have a male heir. So finally he changes the law, right, you know, before he dies. Okay, a woman can succeed to the throne. And what that means is she's just sort of this kind of falls on her and says, okay, here, you're the empress now. So she finds herself in charge of the Habsburg Empire. It's a large land area. It's also a very multinational empire in Eastern Europe that a lot of people, they don't want to be under the control of the Habsburgs. Habsburgs speak German. They speak various other languages. One of the things you'll notice as we go throughout the course, when we talk about nationalism around the world, the Habsburg Empire is one example that we're going to use because you've got a German minority over, all these other people, these Bohemians, these Moravians, these Romanians, these Ruthenians, the Slovaks. You've got all these different, Hungarians, different groups of people that we're not German. We don't speak German. We don't have this. Why are we under the control of somebody else? Okay. Well, what we're going to see is a lot of people are going to try to take advantage of the fact that there's a lady in charge, and they are going to attack Maria Theresa. She's going to lose Silesia, which is part of what is now Poland, to the Prussians in this war, but she managed to keep the Hungarians under her control. The Hungarian princes, they were getting together, and this is our chance to break away from Habsburg rule, and you get these guys with giant sort of hussar mustaches, and Maria Theresa busts in and just cajoles these guys. Says, hey, I'm the one that's supposed to be in charge. How dare you think about breaking away from my empire? She sort of reads them the riot act, and they tell her, okay, we'll follow you. But the problem is, of course, our law didn't change. We can't have a lady be king of Hungary, and so, or we can't have a queen. So she said, fine, I'll be the king. So she's a lady king. Why not, right? Now, Maria Theresa did make some reforms. She was not ignorant of the Enlightenment ideas around her, but it was not for the sake of the Enlightenment. She wanted to reduce inefficiency in the government. She wanted to reduce corruption, but mainly this was to strengthen her position. She remained staunchly Catholic and very conservative socially. The idea of, for example, tolerance of different forms of Christianity, no, that was not what she was interested in. And so the Enlightenment for its own sake was really not, was something that she was interested in. Now, her son, who would later become Joseph II, she made sure that he did get a great education because she knew he was going to be the monarch. And so he would get the benefits, hopefully, that she didn't get before she became the monarch. Now, Joseph II, he was much more open, right? As a result of his training by, for the most part, Enlightenment tutors. In fact, if you want to make the argument who was the most Enlightenment of these monarchs, you'd probably say Joseph II was, right? He used a lot of these Enlightenment ideas for the sake of using them. He thought they were great. So, to this end, this is some of the policies that he put into place. Joseph was going to free the serfs. These are still some landed slaves that were being used to work the land in return for protection. He said, no, okay, you guys are free people now. You go and you make your own money. You do your own thing. You take care of yourselves. So he's going to free those people. He's going to end a lot of these government monopolies. The governments would hand out monopolies in various industries, and they said, okay, you're in charge of this. You run this business. You control this. And in return, they would get this money. And then these people, they liked it because they were the only game in town. You have to buy this product from me. Well, why? Because the government says I'm the only one allowed to sell it or make it or whatever. He says that's not fair. We should have market competition. So he's going to end these monopolies. He's going to institute religious tolerance. Now, of course, their ideas of religious tolerance here is a little different than ours. They're essentially ended at, well, one version of Christianity should tolerate the other. All right? But still, this is the idea that we should stop, fighting with each other over this, right? He's going to create the concept of equality before the law. This is something that we in the United States really, really try to adhere to. Not to say that we always manage to succeed in it, but the idea that you step into a courtroom, you got a rich, sort of powerful, famous person, the law is supposed to treat them equally as a poor, nobody. And this was not the case. If you were a noble, you had one set of law that applied to you, and if you were a commoner, you had a different set of law that applied to you. And this is going to change that. Now we're going to have one law that's going to apply to everyone equally. We all have to play by the same rules. And he's also going to make German the official imperial language. We've got all these different language groups in here. It would be great if we all just learn German. German is the language of the government officials anyway. And we can all speak it, and it'll make things much more efficient. We can send out letters in one language. It'll just work better for everyone. So we look at this, right? We look at bullet point 3 here. Okay, well, good for him, right? This really does seem like an enlightened kind of guy. What's interesting is the way that people respond to this. It's not with, sort of throw, piles of flowers in the air and, roll around and hooray, this is just wonderful. In fact, what you're going to see is Joseph is going to face really, really bad backlash opposition to his reforms from basically everybody, okay? The nobles really despised the loss of power. They don't like this idea of equality before the law. They don't like the fact that they're losing their serfs. They don't like the fact that many of them had been engaged in these monopolies, right? The merchants don't like the trade changes because many of these people who had paid their way up to the top of these monopolies really like the fact that force kept them making profits, right? Even the peasants didn't particularly care for the fact that they were suddenly thrown out on their own. To us, we say, oh, you're freed from slavery. To a lot of these people, it's like, wait a minute, who's going to protect me now? So you have some opposition there. And a lot of these national groups did not perceive this whole you've got to learn German edict as, well, it's for the efficiency of the empire. It's, oh, well, it's the Germanization of us. They're trying to turn us all into little Germans, and they're trying to crush our culture. And so they began this backlash against this. So what you're going to see is Joseph stuck to his guns for the most part throughout his reign, but once he died, other subsequent leaders undid basically all of these. I mean, for the most part, a lot of this stuff gets rolled back because of the increasing opposition to this. So just because you're enlightened doesn't mean that you're going to be loved with this. So there's Maria Theresa. This is her. Not only does she assume the throne and have to do all this work despite the fact that she really wasn't well prepared for the task, she also did that while cranking out, I think, like 16 children. She was an incredibly fertile woman, right? I did the math on this. She spent something like 12 years of her life pregnant. I mean, there are people that go to prison for less time than that. So this was something that was a big change, right? The palace was full of kids with all this. There's Joseph II, good-looking guy, right? He's got the coat, he's got the sword, he's got the sash, but he's also at his desk. So this is an interesting fusion of the monarch with the power of the different, pieces of the government that they're in charge of, and then also though with enlightenment. He's got the globe, he's got the paper, he's got the books. He's smart. He's a smart ruler. He's enlightened, right? So this is the idea with this. So get used to the first of many maps of the multinational sort of jigsaw pattern nation of the Habsburg Empire. And so it's going to be like this until we get done with World War I, when they'll finally start breaking this thing up into its component parts. All right. So we talked about Prussia a couple of examples ago. Now we're going to talk about Russia, right? Russians with this. Well, there's going to be a different set of circumstances that take place in Russia. Russia's kind of different anyway, right? Well, the main person that we're going to talk about here is going to be Catherine. She'll also get the Great added to her name. Well, she ascends the throne in tried and true Russian fashion, the old-fashioned way, which was she has her predecessor murdered. Now, in this case, of course, her predecessor was her husband. So that may seem a little shocking to you, unless you know anything about Russian history, and then you guys go, yeah, okay, yeah, that sort of makes sense, right? Makes you also, I often wonder if, they had the Russians in mind when they came up with the Klingons. But anyway. She is going to come in, and she's got some ideas of reform. She's not necessarily a great Enlightenment thinker, but she's aware of some of these ideas of different ways of forming governments and things like that. Now, she does try to reform the state. She tries to create more freedom for people, but she understands the fact that she really needs the nobility on her side. She needs their money. She needs their troops. She needs them to stick with her. So she's not willing to necessarily run afoul of them. And so she is going to make sure that she keeps them happy. And at one point, she increases the power of the aristocrats over the masses. And what that's going to do is it's going to touch off a rebellion of peasants. Okay? And when you have these peasant rebellions, I mean, these guys, they get their pitchforks and they get their, farm implements. They start burning stuff down and killing noblemen. And they go on these rampages throughout, throughout the countryside. And the idea is they're going to, overthrow the government and all this kind of stuff. And so, well, Catherine is going to crush the rebellion. And when I say crush, I mean crush, okay? She's going to get with the surviving nobles, these people that haven't been initially hit in the wave, gather up these armies, and they're going to go in and they're going to shoot and stab these people. And that's how you deal with it, okay? She's going to learn a very valuable lesson, which is, okay, you can't give a lot of power, you can't give a lot of authority to these people. The Enlightenment idea that the individual is great. No, I don't think so, okay? So what you're going to see is Catherine is going to realize that we have to direct Russia's energies somewhere, okay? Directing it towards internal reform, look where that got us, right? So instead of going in, Catherine is going to point Russia out, and you're going to look. She's going to look towards making external expansion. So a good example of this is expansion towards the west, where her government is going to tag team with Austria and Prussia's government to do a sort of three-pronged assault on Poland, and Poland is going to get wiped off the map. You're going to have the Polish partition, where Poland is going to be carved into essentially three different pieces. The western part is going to go to Prussia, the eastern part is going to go to Russia, and the southern part, Galicia, is going to go down with Austria, down to the Habsburg government. So this is Catherine, right? This is Catherine the Great. There she is. This is, of course, her in her later years, but still, you know, I guess it's not probably a good idea for me to stand quite so close to her. She's pretty dangerous, even on the slideshow here. Catherine was an interesting person. She, you know, rode like a man. She took many lovers. She didn't ride a horse side saddle the way that women were supposed to at this point. She rode like that. So this is her getting painted like this, right? So this is kind of a tour de force of some of the major Enlightenment players, at least from the people that can actually put stuff into practice. You could be a great Enlightenment philosopher and have, you know, these wonderful ideas and publish lots of books, but unless you happen to be the monarch, you're, you know, not going to be able to get anything done yourself. You're going to have to get one of these suckers to listen to you. And so when we see how these guys try to put the Enlightenment into place, in many cases we're going to see it's going to lead to conflict. And so this begs the question that I asked at the top of the slide here: enlightened war? A lot of these people ascribe the ideas of Enlightenment, and they wind up fighting each other. Despite the fact that the Enlightenment argued that the war, this is contest of nations. These guys, they fight over pieces of land, they fight over access to seaports, they fight over, you know, money, just straight up in some cases. That seems kind of stupid, okay? But all of these leaders of nations realize that these nation states in Europe exist in a state of competition with each other. And one of those forms of competition is, in fact, warfare. And what they're after is dynastic improvement. They want their progeny to inherit a bigger, more powerful kingdom than they had before. They also, in some cases, they want long-term security. In many cases, we look at, you know, they're fighting over pieces of terrain. Well, in some cases, they want defensible borders. A nice mountain range to help defend themselves, or a big wide river, like with the Rhine River or something like that. But they also want balance of power, which is you don't want any other nation in the region becoming the nation that kind of dominates everybody else. So you want to make sure that everybody is more or less the same. Now, the early years of the 1700s, you're going to see some warfare that's going to take place, obviously, but a lot of diplomacy is going to be used. But ever increasingly, the centralization and the efficiency of these states are going to create some pretty large armies, and ever increasingly, especially between 1740 and 1815, is these guys are going to go on offense against each other, and they're going to collide. Right? Now, the first major war of this is going to be the War of Austrian Succession, where Prussia is going to use the new status, and I'm really simplifying a lot of this. So for those of you who are sort of fine-tooth combing it with the details, it's like, well, it's actually not quite that simple. Yes, it's true, but I'm just trying to make this make sense for the overall narrative. Okay, and Prussia uses this excuse here of the Empress of Austria's accession to the throne as a pretext to go after Silesia, right? Now, for those of you who have never wanted to conquer Silesia, and you would kind of scratch your head and wonder, you know, why it would be worth it. Silesia is an industrial center here in Poland for what the state of industry is in the 1700s. A lot of mine facilities are going to be there, a lot of timber resources, coal, metal, things like that. Okay, so it's a valuable economic resource. All right. Now, to Maria Theresa's credit, like we talked about, she's going to fight back, but the French are going to intervene and they're going to attack her. They see an opportunity to kind of push the Austrians back, and the French are in turn attacked by the British. You guys keeping track of this? Okay, you guys are going to be really confused when we get to World War I. Right? Now, a treaty is going to end the fighting because nobody really wants to just completely slaughter each other. I mean, the idea is you're going to fight for a while, and okay, you got to prove your point, and then once it gets down to this, you get to this kind of stalemate stage. Let's not just slaughter each other senselessly. We'll go to the peace treaty table and we'll start trading pieces of property and see who's won. The winner of this is undoubtedly going to be Prussia, right? Prussia is going to keep a hold of Silesia despite the events of the war. Come on. So this gives you a little campaign map, right? Takes place here. An idea of kind of back and forth status of many of these mid-18th century conflicts. And on these battle maps, these strategic maps, you see these arrows. And at this point in history, the arrows are pretty indicative. You get these relatively small armies, a few thousand people at most, and they kind of campaign back and forth, and they fight these battles that are relatively restricted in terms of size. Now, by the time we get to the 20th century, the whole map, is going to be full of soldiers, and you get these massive movements of people across the map. And it went kind of screwy again. Okay. Now, we're going to see a number of diplomatic changes in terms of the balance of power in Europe is going to usher in the 7 Years' War. All right, France is going to stop worrying about Austria, which is on their eastern border, as their main enemy, and they realize that, in fact, their new main enemy is Britain. And the reason for that is not encroachment on their territory, right? But in fact, they have the same goal, which is colonial domination around the world. France wants to be a major worldwide colonial power, and Britain, no, we're the main colonial power. Particularly, they're going to be interested here in controlling North America. You're going to see that Britain at this point is going to control, for the most part, the eastern seaboard of North America, minus Florida, which is still going to be Spanish. And then you've got Canada, that is going to be controlled by the French, and then also Louisiana, that's going to be controlled by the French. And both of them have competing claims over what is now essentially the Trans-Appalachian region, the Ohio River Valley, those kind of areas. And so both of them want to control this area, and that's going to lead them to now come to loggerheads as a result of this. Now Russia, okay, is going to become ever increasingly a player here. Prussia wants to expand, and Russia wants to expand as well, and that's going to put them on a collision course, right? Now, Austria is still smarting from the loss of Silesia. They really want Silesia back, and so when the war finally begins, ironically, it's going to take place due to intervention of Americans. George Washington is going to be a British colonel at this point. He's going to open fire on some French troops that he thought was trespassing on British territory. Long story short, that's the pretext for war. These guys have really wanted to fight and solve these issues militarily, and that's what's going to happen. So our teams are, right, Russia, France, and Austria, right, versus Prussia and Britain. Now, Britain, for its part, they mostly abandoned Prussia on the continent. Hey, you German guys, just, I don't know, do your own thing, right? They will send them some gold, they'll send them some money, and they tell them to buy some guns and some mercenaries and stuff like that. Britain is, for the most part, got other things that it's worried about. It is going to be really, really interested in expanding its colonial holdings around the world rather than getting bogged down in fighting, some land war in Europe. Okay, so it's going to be worried about places, like Ohio and upstate New York and things like that, and Canada and India, rather than what's going on here in Europe. So what that means is Prussia now is forced to face down a sort of triple threat invasion. You get three enemy powers that are going to be attacking Prussia from three different directions. This is essentially the nightmare scenario for the Prussians. These guys that are kind of super paranoid about, we're surrounded by enemies. And this is going to be part of the problem. It's going to lead to World War I, as the Germans are going to, we're going to be attacked from the east. We're going to be attacked from the west. What do we do? Okay? And it seems kind of screwy, but you got to remember that this had happened before, right? Well, Frederick is going to earn that the Great. And he proves to be up to the challenge. He's going to hold off the majority of these massive forces for 6 years. He's even going to manage to win some offensive battles. A major battle is going to take place at Rossbach, where his guys are going to get defeated sort of initially, and they're going to pull back, they're going to go behind, they're going to re-attack these guys, and they're going to drive them off the field. But the problem is, essentially, it's 3-on-1 odds or even greater when you actually get to the field of battle. And the alliance, by the end of the 7-Year War, is starting to wear down Frederick's army. He's running out of places to go. He's running out of resources. Okay, and really he's starting to get surrounded, and he's about to be defeated. But then Russia's empress, Catherine, is going to die. She's going to die. Okay, her son, Peter III, is now the new emperor. And the reason that this is important for the policy of Russia is he didn't hate Frederick. He didn't want to go after this guy. In fact, he admired Frederick because Frederick was his uncle. He had known Frederick for a long time. He really liked him. He thought this guy was just utterly fantastic. Why are we waging war against this guy? So Peter III pulls Russian troops out of the war, and now a third of the alliance against Frederick is gone. Well, this means that Frederick now can come back out, and he can wage the kind of war that won't necessarily lead to what you and I would call a smashing victory. He's not going to drive these guys out of their capitals or anything like that. He's going to get a stalemate, which when you consider the fact that he started the war 3 against 1, on 3 different sides, and he manages to hold these guys off, is actually a huge victory. All right? Prussia not only is going to not get crushed and defeated, but in fact is going to hold on to Silesia, and even more importantly, is going to add laurels to Germany's military glory. This is important socially. Why do these guys spend so much time thinking about their military? Why do they think it's so awesome? Because of events like this. Britain, of course, is going to actually be the biggest winner out of all of these groups, because they are going to succeed in expanding their overseas empire very much at the expense of France. So while France is sort of getting bogged down fighting Prussia, that's exactly what Britain wanted them to do. Britain is sending more and more forces across the Atlantic to win their holdings here in North America and then down into Asia to expand their holdings there as well. This is the Battle of Rossbach. This is how this happened, right? You get these guys that are going to come in, and then, like I said, Frederick the Great's going to lead his forces around this hill, and they're going to come in and they're going to hit these guys. This is another one of the major battles. This is Zorndorf that takes place here. The Prussians are going to hold these guys off and eventually counterattack and drive these guys off. Right? These are the British successes. Major successes in capturing Canada from the French and expanding their holdings here in India as well. So, what is the relationship here of the military to society here in the 1700s during the period of the Enlightenment? Right? And for those of you that have had World History 1, and we've mentioned this on previous lectures, is that it actually matters. What's the relationship of the military to society? Because military people, they either have power or they don't have power. Who has power on the battlefield has power in society. It really, really matters. Okay? Well, what we're going to see here is in the 1700s, ever increasingly, professional armies are going to expand significantly in size during this period. Now, there are a couple of theories, again, on armies and how you make them. One is you've got just sort of the volunteer militia. You get a few guys and they train every once in a while, and they've got guns, hanging over the mantle or whatever their house. And then when there's an emergency, they just sort of go out and they fight. The advantage of that is you get to raise fairly large armies because you've got a lot of people who are technically in the militia. They're relatively inexpensive because you don't have to pay these guys to be soldiers all the time. The downside, of course, is they're not well trained. And so they're pretty raw soldiers. Expecting them to do awesome things on the battlefield is not a reasonable expectation. So those are the pros and the cons of that. Professional army is you expect them to be pretty good because they soldier all the time. They're going to have, hopefully, the best equipment that money can buy, as long as you make sure that they're kept up well. The downside, of course, is they're going to be pretty expensive. These guys, you've got to pay their salary, you got to pay for their equipment. And as a result of that high expense, you can only have so many guys in uniform. So you're not going to have these ridiculously massive armies because you can't afford to pay these guys all the time. So what's going to happen, though, is we are going to see an ever-increasing reliance on professional armies, and these professional armies are going to get bigger and bigger. Most of the major continental powers, England is the exception to this, okay, are going to at least double their army size between the period of 1740 and 1780, all right? Now, what's this mean for the soldier? Okay, who are these people, all right? Soldiers at this point are relatively, they're for the most part, they're unarmored because none of the armor that you can wear at this point in history is going to stop any bullets. So there's really no point in wearing any. And they become proficient at marching in step, marching in formation, right? Delivering volleys. The main weapon at this point is going to be a smooth bore, muzzle-loading, black powder musket, all right? And the idea that you're going to kind of aim and pick out a target, like, I'm going to shoot that guy, that's really not reasonable because these weapons are, for the most part, only accurate up to about 75 yards or so. Some of them 60, 75. The old adage was when you were firing one of these things, if you're shooting at something that's 100 yards away, you might as well be shooting at the moon. And the reason for that is you get a smooth bore, doesn't have any rifling, and the ball is round, and it comes out and it doesn't have any spin on it. Those of you that are baseball players and know what a knuckleball is, where you throw the ball and it doesn't have any spin, and it catches the wind and it goes in sort of a random direction. It'll go straight for a while, but eventually it's just going to kind of head off in whatever direction. So the way that these guys found was the most effective way to try to bring somebody down is these guys all get shoulder to shoulder. They just kind of point at a mass of enemy troops, and then they just sort of aim in a general direction and they squeeze the trigger. They all fire at once, and it works like a giant shotgun. You're going to hit something, right? But they had to learn how to operate as single units. You stop thinking individually, you start thinking as the group. The group's firing, I'm firing. The group's marching forward, I'm marching forward, right? We're all in this formation, I'm going to stay and step, you know, that kind of thing, right? Now, the officers of these armies, generally these groups of people, are almost completely controlled by descendants of the landed aristocracy. The idea that you're going to sort of rise up from the ranks, you're going to be this sort of poor, you know, ignorant person, you're going to join the army, and you're going to show through hard work and dedication and battlefield smarts and bravery that you should be a general someday. Yeah, that kind of thing would maybe occasionally happen. Probably not a general. But you could, you know, work yourself possibly into the ranks of the officer corps. But for the most part, no. The idea is if you got a guy who's landed gentry and you got some guy in his late teens and he needs some job, is you land him some ensign's position, some, you know, junior lieutenant's position with one of these military units. He learns the military that way, and he eventually, as long as he's, you know, politically well connected enough and he's a good officer, he'll be the general someday. Okay, so socially that's how that works itself out. Now, what you're going to see is because these guys are professionals, there's a real loathe for a lot of these governments to get their guys killed. They're expensive. They're expensive to maintain. They're expensive to train. And so these wars during this period developed their own sort of quirky set of rules. And really they had developed their own set of limits. Commanders were very reluctant to get their troops killed in these massive battles. So you see a lot of maneuvering. You see a lot of honorable surrenders where they go through this pro forma where our men will never surrender. Oh no, you must. We have your fortress surrounded. And Christian morality says that to avoid the shedding of any more Christian blood, you must surrender honorably. Well, we refuse to be taken prisoner. No, you must march home and swear on honor never to take up arms against our country again. And so it's a fan dance, okay? It was, hey look, we got you surrounded. You want us to blow you away? No, we don't really want that to happen. But we don't want to go home and look like a bunch of cowards. You tell them we were going to kill you all, and we'll just let you walk off as long as you pinky swear not to go and fight us again. And so that's what they would do. And everybody kind of knew, you know, what the deal was, you know. Oh, we can't maintain this position anymore. Why not? Well, they've outflanked us. And so you wouldn't fight. You wouldn't get like 1,000 guys killed. You would say, well, they're going to take the position anyway. So you'd fall back. And then you get reinforcement, and then they fall back. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean there weren't any nasty, bloody battles. There were the occasional ones of these, right? But for the most part, war really had some limits during much of this period, right? Also, we're going to see that these wars, they're not ideologically motivated, right? It's not nation versus nation, people versus people, idea versus idea, right? You know, racial group versus racial group. None of that, okay? It was, my king wants us to attack this. Attack you guys. Why? Well, he wants his fortress so that way he can have access to the, I don't know, the shelled estuary or whatever it is he wants, okay? Cool, whatever. I'm going to fight you guys, all right? Since these are not ideologically motivated, generally speaking, the civilians were left largely untouched, okay? Yeah, you might have an army that march through and they might, you know, take your split rail fence and use it for firewood, or, you know, they grab some of your chickens and cook them in a pot, or dig your potatoes or eat your apples or something like that. But the idea they're going to move into your town, they're going to burn it down because you're one of the bad people. No, you know, I mean, it's, you know, we're not making war against you people. We're making against those guys' armies, you know. And that's going to be one of the changes that will take place when we get to the Napoleonic War, right? Now, Britain was the exception to this rule. Britain is not physically connected to the rest of the continent by land, and so as a result of that, it develops militarily somewhat differently. They are going to concentrate on creating a very large, very powerful navy. 1, defensively. 2, offensively. 3, monetarily. This navy is going to protect their trade that's going to only strengthen as you go on throughout the 17 and the 1800s, until eventually what we're going to see is Britain is thus going to basically rule the waves until after World War I, when finally we'll see that their navy is finally eclipsed by the larger and more powerful United States Navy. So I got a couple of officers here from the mid-1700s to give you an idea kind of who these guys are. right? Now, a lot of you are going to, oh, look, I got silly hats, right? And probably, I don't know, you guys could go to a party with these hats on today and have a pretty killer good time, right? But the rest of the outfit is what we're going to look at, right? You've got the sweatback tail coat, you've got the waistcoat, you've got the trousers, you've got the riding boots, all right? You've got what is essentially a pretty good mimic of what noblemen's clothes are, just with the military kind of trappings of this. This guy's even got his little walking stick, right, with this. And so this gives you an idea of the fact that this is still controlled by the nobility, right? Now, one of the other major changes that's going to begin to work itself in here in the 1700s is going to be the agrarian revolution. One of the major changes in terms of how people produce and distribute food. There's going to be improvements all along these fronts. We're going to see increased crop yields, greater efficiency, and we're also going to see that that's going to mean some stable birth rates, and people are going to get enough to eat. They're going to be able to afford to eat. And we're going to see massive expansion in terms of Europe's population. Now, we're also going to see an improvement in the climate. Now, I know it's hard for some of you guys to believe, right? Nobody tell Al Gore this, but the climate changes all by itself. I'm not saying that humans don't have any impact on it whatsoever, but the Earth cools off and the Earth heats up, and we can't do a whole lot to prevent either one of those from taking place. One of these things that had happened was a little ice age in the 1600s. You didn't have massive glaciers everywhere with talking woolly mammoths like in that little kid's cartoon, right? It wasn't that kind of ice age, but you did have much cooler worldwide temperatures. You had shorter growing seasons, right? And so you had less people staying alive, all right? When this comes to an end here in the early 1700s, you got longer summers, shorter winters, warmer temperatures all around. That means more plants can grow, particularly plants that people need to eat, all right? So we're going to see here that this is going to be more food production that's going to be available, all right? Also, Europeans, especially England first, and then we'll see the other Europeans are going to follow, they're going to actually start borrowing ideas from America based on the plantation system. And of course, Americans have just borrowed this from the Caribbean, who had just borrowed this from the West Africans. So anyway, it's a global system. The idea, instead of breaking things up into these small fields where you got the field 1, field 2, the common field, and all this kind of stuff, you got one big sort of field, right? And you use efficient labor practices to plant and gather and things like that. And so this is going to lead to the enclosure movement, where instead of just these sort of wide expanses of fields, no, this is our field, it's privately owned, and we've got the work crew that comes in and does this, okay? But it also means an unmaking of the old medieval village system, the old manor system, is going to go away. And people for hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years, had lived in this way. There's a common field everybody has access to, and we can kind of all have our own little plots, and this is how we're going to grow food. No, it's going to be big, it's going to be corporate, and it's going to be ridiculously more efficient. So on the one hand, it's kind of a raw sort of jerk out of a system that most people were really, really used to, but at the same point, food's going to hit the market in greater quantity and for decreased cost. All right? So this is the enclosure movement. All right? And with greater food production, not only for humans, we're also going to see greater food production for animals, and you're going to have larger animal herds. You're going to have more protein on the market as well. After 1750, we're going to see that Europe is going to undergo continual population growth. A lot of people who've been studying population they would chart this out and say, okay, population goes up, and then war, famine, plague, disease, something, and it knocks it back down. And then it kind of goes up, and then something horrible happens, and it drops back down. Okay, goes on. And so if you want to plot the slope of the line, there's a general kind of upward trend, but not a huge one. Okay, and so as 1750 was approaching, a lot of people were like, man, population is really starting to go up. It's going to drop. It's going to go down. Something's going to happen. But it didn't. It kept on going up. So this is the enclosure system that is going to take the place of this system as it had existed before, where you would rotate these different fields and everybody kind of had access to it. Instead, no, this is our field. We're going to have this. We're going to operate it, and we're going to be more efficient with it. Now, we're going to have a lot more on the Industrial Revolution as its own thing, but I want to introduce just little bits of this here, and that's its relationship to the Agrarian Revolution. All right? One, if you've got increased farm efficiency, you've got a lot more food hitting the market, all right? And that also means you have a decrease in the number of people that you need to do agriculture. If you're going to be more efficient, that means instead of 100 people that you need to hire for this job in the fields, you may only need 20 or 30. Well, what about the other 70 or 80 people? They're out of work. What are they going to do? Well, they got to do something else. There's enough food for them to eat, but they're going to have to generate the resources in order to buy that food. Okay? Well, we're going to see a transformation. This is going to start in England. Okay? The indigenous industry of England was, at this point, textiles. Typically what you saw was the spinning, weaving, and tailoring of wool into garments. And this was generally done in what you call a cottage industry kind of fashion. The capitalists of this day, the people who ran the businesses, they would show up and they would drop off the raw materials and patterns and whatever, and they would say, okay, I'm going to be back in a week or two or a month or however long, okay, and I'll pay you by the piece for every pair of socks that you knit or every shirt that you make or whatever. The people, they would go to work, they would do whatever on the farm, and then to make extra money is they would make these clothes, and whole families, in some cases, would be engaged in this kind of thing because they wanted to make extra money. Well, the problem with this in an industrial setting was ever increasingly you're going to see that it's going to be machines that are going to be doing the work rather than human handwork. And it's hard, it would be hard then, it's easy to bring the raw materials of cloth and things like that out to cottages. It's hard to bring the machinery out there. Okay, we're going to bring the water loom out to you guys this week and then out that way. In fact, it was a lot easier to bring the workers to the machinery, or bring the workers to the work rather than the work to the workers. Right? So this demands a factory-based industry. You're going to have a physical plant, and the workers are going to show up at this, right? Now, a lot of these people, a lot of hand workers, they're going to be thrown out of work as well. It's also going to homogenize the workforce that remained. Going away, are going to be the people that were particularly skilled at one thing, really, really good at this. No, they're all about the same. You work the same machine that I do, right? By 1787, and this is sort of an arbitrary date, but by 1787, England was experiencing what we would call a major revolution in humanity, okay? And that is people moving away from being mostly engaged in the production of food to being engaged in something, making something that we can't eat. That's a big change, okay? Now, this is the point where we're at now, only a relatively small percentage of human population, at least in industrialized countries, are engaged in actual food production, which is sort of important. I mean, you got to eat every day. And they make other things that you can't eat with this. And so this is some of this early technology. I know it doesn't look like much of a factory, that you've got this big sort of dyeing vat, and you've got part of it hung on the sawed-off stump of a tree. But these are some of these early factories. Some of them were, a lot of them, in fact, were open air. And they replaced this. This is the cottage industry. This is some farm family here in England, and they're making scarves or shirts or socks or I don't know, whatever they're doing. But this is what they're working on. And this is what they use to make extra money. And these are one of these open-air factories. You're using, in this case, coal and water, steam power, horsepower, donkey power, in order to power the machines. These people would show up, and the machines are doing most of the work rather than the people. So this is the water loom. And you'll notice that a lot of these are in the textile industry. Like I said, this is going to be the first one to get revolutionized as they go on. Now, not everybody's happy about this. This would spawn eventually a movement in England called the Luddites. Right? King Lud would send these people out. They would break the machines with hammers at night because they didn't like the fact that machines were taking their jobs. But progress would eventually go on, and the machines were there to stay, at least so far. So that's the end of this. We'll deal with, ever increasingly as we get into the late 17 and the early 1800s, what happens when the Enlightenment causes revolutions.